Okay.
Welcome back to anyone that's watching this. This is part two for our interview series with Abby talking about all things nutrition. And Abby, thanks for doing this. I wanted to have you back on to dive deeper into what we talked a little bit about last time, or we at least touched on it, which was disordered eating. You've written some articles about different aspects of this, but I'd like to hear you talk about what that is to start off.
Yeah, so I think I really think of it as a spectrum of disordered eating into eating disorders. If we're thinking about kind of like a red, yellow, green situation, what would exist in the red category is a specific eating disorder. So that includes avoidant restrictive food intake disorder, binge eating disorder, bulimia nervosa, um, and anorexia, as well as like pica, and there's a few other ones that live in there as well. And then there's kind of a big umbrella term that's called EDNOS, so eating disorder not otherwise specified. So because the DSM-5, which is the diagnostic manual for mental health disorders, is very, very specific in criteria. What that ends up doing is that ends up leaving a lot of individuals that may not fit a specific bulimia nervosa or anorexia nervosa diagnostic criteria, but it's also recognizing that they don't have a healthy relationship to food and it's starting to negatively impact their overall health and well-being. So that's a diagnosed eating disorder. And then we have this interesting yellow space, how I like to think of it as disordered eating. And so disordered eating to me is anything that is starting to impact your overall health and well-being, that's starting to take up a lot of mental space and then also start to really alter and change the way that you are living and existing. And I like to put it under a big umbrella of a lack of flexibility around the way that you are eating and around the way that you are moving your body. So this can include things that aren't yet in the DSM-5. Hopefully, in an updated version, they will be in there, but specifically orthorexia. So it's this obsession with the purity and cleanliness of eating. So we hear about eating clean all the time. And so it's really like the elimination of entire food groups. Say it's carbohydrate, say it's gluten when you don't have a specific dietary allergy or need to eliminate gluten. I think also there's a big issue right now with what I'll call chemophobia, and it is actually that. So it's a fear of specific chemicals or additives or things like that in food. So
So would this
you
be like
see,
seed oils and that kind of those type of content
seed
things
oil,
that you
yeah,
hear
totally.
about?
Seed
Yeah.
oils, yeah, sugar, any sort of like emulsifiers, additives, things like that would all kind of fit in this orthorexia category.
Mm-hmm.
And then I think there's a big aspect in thinking of the training and exercise and movement aspect of it. A lot of times there's a big intersection between that and actual eating disorders as well as disordered eating because you're doing something that is likely in an unsustainable way and not for the intention of like, oh, I just really enjoy this thing. It's for either changing your body. There's a big ego aspect to it. And again, it comes down to that inflexibility. And so right now, in the research, they're really trying to determine what is exercise dependence and what is exercise addiction. And so there's a few different scales that we can look at for that, but it's where you're using exercise to change your mood. It's where it's dose dependent, meaning that if you say you're working out 3 days a week to get the same feeling or effect or high, you have to go higher and higher. And then also the another really big aspect of this is that you are prioritizing any sort of exercise or training over other relationships in your life, so family, friends, as well as like other things you have to do to live and survive. So say it could be like basic things, it's like house chores, like neglecting those, or even like work and things like that.
So it sounds
So that's
like
a
just going,
big spectrum.
yeah, it sounds like going off the deep end, kind of with all things fitness. You go into it and you go, this is my whole personality. I'm going all in with trying to change my body, my mood. I'm ignoring everything else. On top of that, I'm going in with what seems like would be a large commitment in terms of diet, but ends up being something that takes a toll on your body, and you go completely in with it versus being completely out of it. Am I following along so far?
Totally. Yeah. And I think it's really important to really be clear with when I think of eating disorders, I think they typically occur, they're multifaceted. So there's a genetic component. There's also a lot of environmental components to it as well.
Like the
And normally
social
it
aspects to it.
starts totally social, your family of origin, what your
Mm.
caregiver's relationship to food is, what you surround yourself with in media, and all these different things. So it's not, I think there's a lot of guilt and shame in from an individual level, but also from, a peer and societal level. If someone knows someone with an eating disorder, especially if it's a caregiver, they're like, oh, is it my fault? Did I cause this? And it's like, it's so much bigger than that. And I think there's a lot of aspects to where we hear a lot that eating disorders are a source of control. And I like to really reframe that because it's not a control. It's someone, and I would even kind of break down a little bit more as in someone and also their nervous system trying to find a place of safety. So in our current culture today, it's kind of described as diet culture and wellness culture, and we can trace that long lineage back to even, purity culture and white supremacy and all these other things. But
Mm.
when someone has an eating disorder, because there's so much shame involved with it, we really need to destigmatize that and also tell people it's like, hey, you're doing what you were told to do. If you're existing in a fat body, it's like you're doing all the things that society told you to do. You're not trying to find control, you are like doing the quote unquote right thing. Or I think even in the aspect of even going back to kind of like developmental aspects, is these really develop at a pretty, around it's they don't always develop around puberty, but it's not uncommon that they develop around puberty. So when there's a big influx of hormones, that's also sometimes changing and impacting brain chemistry, but also really starting to change and affect how bodies are starting to develop. So I think that's one really ripe space. And I find that if someone in their family is either experiencing a lot of trauma, or has a lot of unmet mental and emotional needs, their body's trying to find that level of safety. And so this can really start to amplify in a lot of different ways. So it could be through a maladaptive way of eating. It could be through a maladaptive relationship to exercise. It could also be through like substance use or things like that. It's a person again trying to seek safety and also knowing that that way that they're seeking safety is also re-traumatizing their body.
So when you say this is a young person in their developmental stages, so I'm thinking teenagers that are coming into that point where they're trying to find that thing where they feel sure of the thing they're doing. So this is whether it's a habit, something to depend on that's reliable. Is that kind of what we're talking about, or no?
It can be reliable, but I think there's a
Do
big
they find
difference
reliance in
in,
it? Like, are they just do they feel like it's reliable? I guess is what I'm saying.
yeah, it can feel reliable. It can feel safe, right? So
Right.
again, if we're trying to seek safety, it's like, okay, what is this thing that I'm either, say it's sport, right? Of
Yeah.
this is the way that I get validation. This is the way that I get accolades. And then even thinking from a body change perspective, because we always praise, people's body change if it's starting to shift into a what is recognized societally as good, quote unquote, which would be, someone shrinking their body, someone getting smaller. That's often praised. And so, again, it's this way of like, okay, I'm worthy, I'm enough, and I'm getting validation from this, which means I'm doing a quote unquote good job.
So doing this to fit in with quote unquote norms.
Yeah. Hmm.
So with disordered eating, so it's and I've seen stuff where working in the industry, you see someone come in and they like we talked about last time, they're either all the way in or they're completely out. So either they start an exercise routine and they start almost obsessively thinking about food in a arguably neurotic way where they're really focusing on counting calories or using an app that estimates it, or they use some type of device where excuse me, where they're tracking their calories throughout every workout they do and they have to hit a specific number. It's got to be an even number, otherwise it wasn't a quote unquote good workout. I mean, what other things do you see in terms of average behaviors for someone pursuing fitness start to arise? Like what else comes up?
Yeah, I would say it's that really, perfectionistic way of thinking about things. So anytime that we start to include numbers, whether it be from what you're eating from a calorie or macro standpoint, or from numbers from like any sort of fitness device or things like that, like think we can look at all of these as an aspect of, I want to know, like, I don't love anyone really counting calories. I think there's a lot of ways that we can eat without a lot of these metrics, but sometimes
Right.
it can be a tool. Sometimes even with, any sort of fitness device, like maybe some heart rate metrics might be really helpful so you don't end up overtraining. But I think it's really that maladaptive approach to where all those metrics are the thing that matter the most. And especially when it comes to calories. So it's using this tool from the beginning and then also having this tool be something that is, the end all be all and kind of abused in that way. So I think all tools can be great until they become really unhelpful. So I would say, yeah, it's that. And I think it's really just comes down to if someone's starting a new regimen or, trying to create change or some new habits, it's really hard in our society to have nuance, right? We see this in social media. We see this in so many different things. Like we have a really hard time with nuance. We really like boxes. We like yes or no, good or bad, black or white. We like these things
We like
because it
easy.
tells us again, we like easy. Yeah, it tells us that I'm doing a good job or I'm not doing a good job. And I think again, from that place where we don't have a lot of praise or validation or other ways to really see someone, that ends up being the way that they feel seen. And so I think that's one aspect is, again, we need to have a lot of nuance when we're starting these things. And just if we're looking at the overarching aspect of it being inflexibility is a big common trait between disordered eating and eating disorders, then we need to look at, okay, how do we start something that has a lot of flexibility? Because also we're human and we're gonna not, move in all the ways that we want to on a weekly basis. We're going to eat in ways that maybe weren't planned. And like, that's kind of the beauty of life is having a little uncertainty and curiosity versus
Yeah.
just living by this very structured regimen. But I think that we need to always embark with a lot of compassion and a lot of flexibility and a lot of empathy for ourselves. And like with that curiosity, then we can start to really understand, what is it about exercise that I feel like I have to do it in this way. It's like, was that an early childhood thing that like you had to do a certain amount of things or like that was the only way that you could fit in, and then once that became unsustainable then you stopped. So that's the only way a lot of people I feel like know how to engage with food or movement. If they're not quote unquote dieting, what are they doing? I think it's because we don't have a lot of education around how do we move in a flexible way, around what are the benefits of these things outside of changing your body, and around how does food show up in our lives and what are the benefits of it that aren't just calories and nutrients, but what are the ways that it really starts to add to our lives. And I think having a lot of knowledge around, what does a carbohydrate do in your body? Once you have the knowledge of what it does, then you're probably not going to want to go on an extreme keto diet because you're going to understand that, oh, this plays a really important role in so many different factors that I have this background and foundational knowledge that, oh, that's probably not a good choice.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I I remember when I was in high school, we had to take a nutrition class that just talked about a little bit of surface level nutrition, and they brought up calories and they brought up macros and that kind of stuff, and it was the first time that anyone ever heard fat discussed in a way that wasn't a magazine headline at the grocery store, like burn fat or shred fat or low fat this, and I think that goes back to the nuance of nuance isn't eye catching. And so in the last episode, we talked about where someone starts off looking at nutrition. Question one, I think you said, was number one, are you eating enough? So when I think of are you eating enough, I just think, are you eating regularly? Are you eating a variety of things? And do you feel like you have the energy to take on your day? Is there anything that I'm missing there, or what else would you add to that?
No, I think that's it. It's like, are you eating regularly? As in, typically, that's at least 3 times a day, like 3 meals. And then, looking at, depending on how you are engaging with movement in your life, building in snacks around that. And then also, most of the time, people probably need a snack between lunch and dinner because that could be an 8 hour fast in your day, or like a 6 to 8 hour fast when your body's really active. And so it's like, probably need to have 3 meals, probably need to at least have one snack. You also probably need to buffer things in around if you are intentionally moving your body. And it's like, we get in this extreme fixation with calories and numbers. It's like when people run all of their calories and metrics, they think that as that is now like a stamp and rule. And it's like, you don't wake up with a you don't wake up and roll out of bed and all of a sudden your body's empty and you have to like build this up. Same thing as if you don't meet your protein goals in one day, like your body doesn't dissolve. So it's like, I think we need to like remember that like our bodies are really good at surviving, and we need to give them the best shot that we can to survive and be balanced so that we have the energy to, engage with our peers, to do things that you like, to have energy after work. I would say that's the number one thing is people are like, I'm so tired after work, I can't do anything. And it's like, well, are you eating enough? And it's like, once we start to add more and they're like, oh, I could like go on a walk, or I could, like hang out with my kids. And I'm like, great, lovely. But I think people are so used to undernourishing themselves and underfeeding themselves that that becomes really problematic.
So with undernourishing, what questions do you have people reflect on to look at whether or not they are undernourishing or if they're getting enough?
So I think one is I'm looking at, again, like what is the frequency that you're eating? If you're only eating once a day, you're not going to be able to meet your overall like base caloric needs. So that's one, is like, what is the frequency that you're eating? And then, I'll go through and kind of ask like, show me, like, tell me a little bit about what a typical day is for you. And through that, I can start to pinpoint, I'm like, ooh, you do not have enough carbs, or you do not have enough protein, or you don't have enough fat, or like we're missing some of these basic things. And I would say one of the main issues with that of someone meeting their needs, I would say it's typically not intentional. Well, it can be really intentional, but I would say for someone who doesn't really who's never struggled with disordered eating or an eating disorder, it's not that. It's really just the awareness, because dieting and calorie restriction and food is so demonized in our culture, and like calorie restriction is so normalized that it's like, yeah, how is someone supposed to meet their needs if they're surrounded by all of this misinformation?
So for information, where I think myplate.gov or the dietary guidelines are two go-to places. But if someone, obviously if they're on Instagram, well, obviously you're a great person to follow. I always tell people to go follow your account because you put out quality information. Who else would you recommend looking at in terms of, I guess, topics around food? They post quality information about it.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's again, a lot of nuance here. So there's a whole slew of like peers of dietitians and my really good friends who kind of are existing in this anti-diet space that's really looking at how do we start to reframe the narrative around food and start to shift that. So like Kara Harpstreet's one of them. I would also say, oh my gosh, I'm totally blanking. This is hard right now.
No, you're good.
I'll send you a list. I'll send you a list. But there's like
you work with the Eat My Way app. That was a thing I saw you posting about for a while. I'm guessing is that a team of dietitians that you've worked with and colleagues?
Yeah, totally. Team of dietitians. Yeah. And so that can be a great avenue. And then even thinking about, Lane Norton, I think he has a really, overall, from a research perspective, has a really balanced and nuanced way to talk about all of these things. I think there's some ways for some individuals. He does have a focus on, are you eating enough? There's some gray space there. And I'm like, I wish maybe you could have said that differently. But overall, I'm like, you are a super solid source of information that's really great at relaying research and kind of allowing it to be really accessible to the average individual who doesn't have a PhD or master's in nutrition. So I think that can be really helpful. Great source there. And I would just say that if having some media literacy, and if anyone that you're coming across as making a blanket statement of this is good or this is bad or yes or no or eat this or never eat this or this is going to kill you, like whatever. If it's a big, broad statement like that, I would say big red flag. And then
Yeah.
even another aspect, talking about caloric restriction or, being in a deficit, like the threshold technically for undernourishment is fewer than 1,800 calories a day. And so that means that if you're consuming less than that, that's likely going to lead to overall significant deficiencies in overall energy and calories, as well as essential vitamins and minerals. And outside of just how is food, maybe I think people are assuming that how is this changing my body, but we also need to look at how is nutrition really optimizing our body. If we don't meet this at least basic goal of 1,800, and I think that's still not enough. That's the threshold of
Yeah.
like, do you have enough resources on board? But it's like if we aren't even doing that, what's going to suffer? Our mental and emotional health. We have
Stress.
skyrocketing rates right now, yeah, of anxiety and depression and all of these other things. And I think there's even just like this huge, we see it in media right now, the huge emotional dysregulation and divide. And it's like, are we so angry right now because we're also hungry? It's like there's so many different things. And then if someone's intentionally trying to move their body and exercise and train for something, it's like you're not getting that at least 1,800. Your body's not going to prioritize, changing your overall like muscular function and quality. It's going to focus on, does my liver have enough calories? Does my brain have enough calories? It's going to focus on the basics before we can really start to work at that optimization.
Yeah. You're going to survive but not thrive. It's just, yeah.
Exactly.
Well, I just think of, I think we've talked about this before. I was in a course in the military where they intentionally restrict your food. That's part of the course to add stress. And you absolutely fall apart. I went through the course twice. The average amount of weight lost is over 20 pounds. People get skin infections. I had multiple cellulitis infections. I had a hole in my knee. Your hair doesn't grow back. Your nails don't grow. If you get a cut on your face, it doesn't heal. And so when people say, I'm not eating, I just need to restrict, I go, you're going to make yourself sick. And yeah, it's just so bad. I can't emphasize that enough to people, but yeah, with this stuff around disordered eating, obviously there's the extremes that you see on social media because those are so eye-catching. From a marketing perspective, it works. I guess I almost want to tell people just to turn off that stuff because it's rare that you see something good. Like 99% of the content you see on social media is terrible. And I think was it the Australian government that recently did a study where they looked at all of the nutrition posts that were on social media, and the majority of them were all made up or bad information, and only a small percentage were actually decent info. And it makes sense because the exciting stuff is usually the crap stuff. Just like, I don't know. But yeah, I feel like a lot of people just get lost with this stuff and they don't know where to go. And yeah, I don't know where. It's not even a question with this. It's just a statement with that.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think one really important thing for either individuals who are navigating this space and or, people who are taking care of little ones, so parents, caregivers, things like that. Our relationship with food and our bodies and movement and exercise is all going to trickle down. It's kind of like even like a generational trauma effect. And so I would just encourage people, instead of having rules around food,
Mm.
rules do not teach skills and they don't teach us why. They just teach us how to live in this binary approach instead of being like, saying like, oh, carbs are bad. A, they're not. But it's looking at like, okay, how do we, instead of having this rule of maybe have a lot of nuance and explaining like, what does this do for us? How does this serve us? Why do we not want to only eat carbs all day, every day? How do we want to have a balance of these things? So I think it's, if I could tie that one up in a little bow, it would just be that rules do not teach skills and
Yeah.
also do not teach like long-term shifts and the ability to, have overall reasoning and thought and processing. And then I would also say, this is one thing I want to touch on too, of like, I think people they think of eating disorders in a very specific way. If we think about what someone like someone who does have an eating disorder, we typically imagine someone who's very emaciated, who looks a certain way, who, it's like all these inherent biases that come up. And I want to be really clear that I would say, and I think a lot of people think that eating disorders are really not that common. And because when we look at the data, it's only about 9% of the US population who's actually diagnosed with an eating disorder. And
Does
while
that go
that
back to
number
what you were
is,
saying earlier about the diagnosis criteria being pretty narrow for right now?
yep,
Okay.
it's that. It's the diagnosis criteria. So for anorexia nervosa, there's a specific BMI criteria that you have
Okay.
to meet that diagnosis. And now there's this other thing called atypical anorexia, to where it's all the same things, all the same negative effects from a physiological perspective, but you're not meeting that BMI criteria because we're making this assumption that all bodies who are restricting are going to respond in the same way, which means in like a severe amount of weight loss and cachexia, which is not true. I think it's actually really a beautiful thing about bodies because they're so good at surviving that it's like some people actually may gain weight in restriction. And that's because of like the stress response of the body. And a lot of that comes down to genetics. And so I want to be clear that, all right, we have this 9% number. But, and again, there's like the whole criteria, but I'm going to ask you this. Have you ever been screened for an eating disorder by a medical provider?
Never.
Even like a simple question of have you ever had an eating disorder or struggled with disordered eating? Probably not, huh?
No. Yeah. I've never had that asked.
Exactly. So that's where I think the first step and the first error is really lying, is that we aren't screening for these things. So therefore, if we aren't screening every single person, and then also if we aren't like if we don't have this criteria that's appropriate, then we're not actually capturing how many people are struggling. Because I would say that I know very few, especially peers of mine, that have never struggled with disordered eating or an eating disorder at some point in their lives, whether it's active or some point in the past. Like, I would say, how many people, if you could even think about right now, like, do you know someone who's had an eating disorder before,
I would argue.
diagnosed or not?
Yeah. I would argue undiagnosed. I know multiple. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so I think that's a really important factor that we're not including, because people are like, oh, it's really not that bad. Like, it's really not that much of the population. Like, yeah, because we're not asking the right questions.
Yeah. Oh, I think it because people they picture what they can see, a lot of times I think now working in this field, there's a lot that you can't see until you start to ask questions and start to just observe what someone does or doesn't do or how they talk about certain things. And hearing what you discussed at the beginning of this, it was the perceptions around how someone looks at food or thinks about food or nutrition or their body. And those things are way more telling in a lot of ways than just looking at someone on a scale or in the mirror or, what size their body is. Because I just think that's where people think about it is, oh, that person is super skinny, they must have an eating disorder. And that's as far as that conversation goes. Beyond that, it's like, nah, don't even care.
Yeah, or it's like that person's, yeah, so thin that they clearly have an eating disorder. It's like, well, they could have cancer. They could have Graves'
Yeah.
disease. They could have a whole variety of different things going on
Yeah.
that you are making that assumption about. And then I think on the flip side, especially in the fitness community, it's like, oh, they're so fit, like they couldn't have an eating disorder. And I would even wager that those who have, who are going to be more so fit in that category may even be at a higher risk, because one, they're getting that validation, and that praise, so that if they were to stop doing what they were doing, they wouldn't get that anymore. And so there's this whole like psychological ego aspect that goes to it. So I would say people who quote unquote look really fit and look really healthy from our societal viewpoint may actually be really, really struggling.
Yeah. On the,
And then there's
especially on
people
the,
who, yeah, who exist in large bodies and fat bodies who are struggling with life-threatening anorexia, but aren't going to fit what that narrative looks like.
yeah. Yeah. That quote unquote image of it. Yeah.
Hmm.
It's a heavy conversation. It's just,
It's
yeah,
a,
it's tough.
it's Yeah, and it's a really hard conversation, It's like because food is so multifaceted in our culture, in our community, and how we were raised, and like all of these different things from an early age, and then into, as we get older, we get even more noise with that. And so and it, because food is just so big and something that we engage with multiple times a day, I think it makes it even more challenging from that perspective. And I would say that if someone is struggling, it's not that you don't have to live this way. If food and exercise are taking, and your relationship with your body is taking up a lot of time and mental energy, like there are so many amazing professionals out there who are very, very skilled in working with these disorders and helping you get the recovery that you deserve, because there's so much more to life than just food and our bodies. There's so much that can exist beyond that.
Yeah, well, the thing is, with the obsession of that stuff is people. I've had clients come to me and they go, "I want a calorie recommendation. Tell me what to eat," because I think it helps them at least have a narrow picture. But I go, one, I don't do that. I don't want to spend days weighing food and going, oh, how many calories is this, and like pull out this stupid app and enter in these numbers, and now I have to get a calculator, and it's a pain. Two, it makes you start to look at food as this calories thing only, and then you go out to lunch at a restaurant when someone invited you and just to have a good time, and now you're not having a good time. You're now thinking about, oh, look at the label. And now menus at a restaurant will say how many calories are in it, et cetera. It just goes on and on and on. And then I feel like at that point it becomes overwhelming, and that's where it goes back to. It's like not wanting to look at what your spending was for the last month because you're like, I don't want to do it at all. And you go, well, I mean, you could look at it, but just don't get obsessive of it. It's just weird. I don't know. If someone's getting overwhelmed with it, but they're like, I got to do something. You look past am I eating 3 times a day? If the answer is yes, what's beyond that for that next phase of what should I start looking at or thinking about?
I think is always looking at, instead of seeing food and nutrition and all of these things as, how am I eliminating things, restricting things, or, compensating with exercise? It's like, how can I add to my life? So how can I add in, an aspect of things that would feel good instead of being like, I'm only eating vegetables. It's like, well, that's unsustainable. And
Yeah.
also, if you only ate broccoli all day, every day, you would still be undernourished. So that wouldn't be good for you either. So it's like, how
Yeah.
do we really take an additive approach to food? Because our brains have such a negative bias around things. So, if we focus on what we can't have, the moment that we do that, that's all we can think about. So if we can focus on, oh, I'm going to have some intention towards adding things into my day, well, not restricting, I'm not going to restrict and tell myself I'm never going to eat out or eat fast food or eat chips or whatever. It's like, how do we just add to those things and slowly start to make those changes? And then I think even with, exercise, there's so much around it where people truly do not like it, truly have a really negative relationship with
And
it. And
that's
again, that goes
normal.
back to, yeah, and it's normal because it is seen as this punishment. It's like, oh, I
Yeah.
ate this, therefore I have to go do this. Where it's like, oh, no, no, no. How do we start to look at movement from a place of, how can I use this as a way to be in my body and experience the world around me, and a way to, like find some aspect of like joy or freedom or something else that isn't related to how do I look? Because, when we just boil it down to how do I look and how many calories am I burning, we really start to get this myopic approach. And we really start to, I would say, overall, even from a training perspective, and I love all of our coaches and trainers. Obviously, you've been one of them. I have so much respect and gratitude for them. But I think when there's trainers out there who are saying, if you do X, Y, and Z, this will happen. It's like you're actually cheapening your trade
Yeah.
overall
And you
because
don't know that
you're
either.
not,
Yeah.
yeah, because you're only seeing it in this one viewpoint instead of like, how is this going to help you when you're 80? How is this going to help you have more energy to do the things that you love and enjoy? I think it's really just problematic when we start to look at it, just what is this? How is this going to change my aesthetic?
Yeah. It I think that's the biggest thing within the fitness industry is it just comes down to you go into a gym, and I've been in numerous gyms at this point. I think Evolve is the best. Obviously, I'm biased, but yours was the first that I got into, and then I went to other ones, and then I realized, oh, Evolve is not the norm at all. And I mean that as a compliment because the norm is, oh, we got to get a fat loss challenge, 6 weeks, 3 weeks, abs, booty tone, booty class, God, what else? Burn this belly fat.
We could
right
go
here
on all day, yeah.
We could go on all day, and it's like I feel like as practitioners, I feel like it starts with us trying to say, or at least create an environment where we go, this is not just that. That is so narrow, and that this goes into quality of life. This goes into just everything within quality of life. But oftentimes that's all it goes to. I feel like because it's simple to grab attention. Hey, you want to look this way? Do this. I guarantee it'll work.
Yep. It's simple and it's sexy and it that may be a side effect of what you're doing, but that shouldn't be the intention. And I think that's another thing is we look at even physical activity, and when we look at it from a weight loss standpoint in a research setting, it actually doesn't do that much from, a body change perspective. You may get some body composition changes, when people come in, they're like, I don't want to get too bulky. I'm like, I don't think you understand how hard that is. It's not.
There's a reason steroids exist.
You're not just going to pick up a 10-pound dumbbell, get bulky, And so I think there's so much, but it's when we look at that, we're also missing the extreme mental and emotional and also community benefits of movement and exercise. Sure, during the pandemic, there were some individuals who did really well moving at home. But I would even say now those individuals, I can't really do it like I did then, and I don't know why. And it's well, because we have this option and we have this huge need to also be in community and be supportive. And because, gyms are often thought of as what's called third spaces. So space outside of the home, space outside of work, but it's this third space that people can go to and commune at. And I think that that's one thing that we really missed out on. So from a mental health perspective, movement is huge. I think from a physiological perspective of, preventing the risk of developing some sort of chronic disease, so type 2 diabetes, cardiovascular disease, so many different things, that is one of our most powerful tools. And when we look at the exercise recommendations, it's really not that big. It's not going out and running a half marathon. It's walking 150 minutes a week. It's very different than what people think it is. And so it's this really beautiful tool that we have. And again, to be in our bodies. And yeah, it just does so many things. And it's maybe your body changes, but also maybe it won't. And if we just focus on that, we're missing out on all of the other beautiful things, looking at one puzzle piece versus looking at the whole puzzle.
Yeah. With someone coming in, we've talked about this privately in the past, where it's common within both of our jobs to have someone come in and say, I want to lose weight. And that's as far as that goes. And it's difficult for people to respond back to a question of, okay, why? And what happens when you do lose that weight? Are you going to stop moving? And, where does this go? And would you be willing to lose that weight if you felt awful, felt exhausted, maybe you're in pain? Would you still do it? And I feel like no one's having those conversations a lot of times in gyms.
Totally. And I think part of it is, because someone's going to just a big gym, it's they may get a 30-minute personal training session and that's it. So it's the trainer and professional doesn't have time to ask questions and get curious. And I would say anytime someone says, I want to lose weight, or I want to do this, I want to get my body fat percentage down to this or whatever, it's just ask why and get curious of yeah, tell me a little bit more about that and what would that do for you? I had someone recently, a friend who weighed themselves and knew that that was probably not the best choice going into it, and then was not excited about the result. And I think so much of it boils down to is we put weight in this category and we associate so much with our body weight of, it's this threshold mark of I won't ever get above this, or when I'm below this, I feel better, feel better, I have more energy and whatnot. And I'm well, we really need to boil that back and know that it's not the weight, because if you were to be at a higher weight, but were mentally and emotionally happy. And if you could do all the things that you love, and maybe even at that point, if it was more from a body composition standpoint, if that was more muscle based, like, would you still hate that number? And it's like, no, probably not. Or it may be a little bit softer approach to it. And so I think it's really shifting and looking at what are the behaviors that you were doing at this space instead of equating weight equals this or my
Yeah.
weight equals this. It's either good or bad. It's like, well, let's really boil it down and start to get really curious about what does that mean to you? What does that represent to you? And I think a lot of people, will say lazy. And I'm very big into language with a lot of my clients. I'm like, tell me what that word means to you. Like tell me a little bit more about how we're using this because I think it gets to be a place where people just are really hard on themselves and are really mean to themselves and are truly their own biggest bullies.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, I'm guilty of that in a lot of ways. It's just, I feel like from a lot of people's perspective, that comes from, if I'm hard on myself, it's almost like that tough love parent, at least that's what the belief is. Like, oh, if I just say it to myself like this, it'll give me the nudge I need. But oftentimes it just kind of wears you down for the long term. So,
Yeah, and I think a lot of people come to me and they're like, I want to be here and I want you to be like, I'm going here to, be accountable. I'm like,
yeah.
I am not here to hold you accountable. I am here to not like have this, hierarchy approach. I'm here to walk beside you and figure out and be curious the whole way of like, what's working for you? What do you want? Oh, why is this not working for you? Like, how do we start to shift and change that? It's like we get to walk side by side versus I'm walking in front of you and blowing a whistle and telling you that you're doing a bad job. Like, that
Yeah.
just shame never works. It just
It,
doesn't.
it doesn't last.
It
It's
works maybe for a short period of time,
yeah,
but it's not going
very
to be.
short. So short. It's just, it makes me think I think a lot of that, the punishment side of the physical activity stuff comes from, again, going back to the military. You're getting people to do things that they don't want to do. And, boot camp doesn't last forever. I've done it. It sucks. And guess what? Everyone goes back to their normal thing after a few months, and because it sucks. And so you think, well, if this doesn't last, why would I do that in the first place? And so, yeah, I hate telling people like, oh, I'm going to be a drill sergeant. I'm like, this is temporary. It doesn't
Right.
work.
And even just from your peer group, who were in boot camp with you and who went through training with you, out of those individuals, who is actually still moving right now and like moving in a way that feels good?
Almost none. Almost none. Maybe like 10%. Yeah, it's just, yeah, it's crazy. It's not surprising. I wouldn't want to go back to boot camp. It's the whole time you're going, oh, I got this someone who's my age or possibly even younger than me yelling at me over something trivial and holding me accountable. Yeah, why would you stick with that?
Yeah, and so I think again that's going to be something where, maybe going into it, people had a really good relationship to movement or through it, but then once they're out of the military, and I see this all the time. I have family and friends who've been in active duty, and it's like now it's so hard because that's their only space that maybe they remember moving, and also it can be a really traumatizing thing in that sense. So it's
Yeah.
like that's the only memory that they have and the only memory that their body has. It's like, yeah, you probably don't want to go back there. So it's like, how do we really start to shift into your movement doesn't have to look like that, but it could be so many other things.
Yeah. Yeah, it doesn't have to be from this dark, negative place. It's not a punishment. But
Yeah.
I think we should end it there. I think we should take a pause from this heavy conversation. um, Again, Abby, for anyone that hasn't seen any of your content and wants to find out more about some of the stuff you put out or some of the information you recommended today, where can people find you?
Yeah, so you can find me at Abby the RD on Instagram. I have a TikTok. I'm not really on it, but you can go back there if you want to. And then also through my website, evolveflg.com. And I would also say there's really a lot of great, if you're struggling with an eating disorder or disordered eating, or if you're just like, I don't know. I would say if you don't know if you have a healthy relationship to food in your body, then you should start to get really curious about it. And so Project Heal is a really, really great resource. They have a lot of really great articles. They have a lot of really great just education around, what are eating disorders, and how are they presenting? If you're struggling, how do you get help? They even have scholarships for financial assistance, because that's another big barrier in recovery and in treatment, is accessing care.
Oh
So I
wow.
would say that if you're struggling, if you're struggling, like reach out. Definitely look at Project Heal. I really, really love them. NEDA does exist, so National Eating Disorders Association, they exist, but I really, really love Project Heal and the work that they do from an intersectional perspective. Um, there's also Quip Health, which is really great. So there's a lot of options out there. And I would say if you're struggling, this is not worth your possible life. And this is not worth, your relationship to food and body for the rest of your life. Eating disorders are the second deadliest mental health condition, coming just behind opioid use disorder. And so I think it's really important that we are very serious about this, and that it's not a nonchalant conversation. But if you're struggling, if you know someone who's struggling, there's a lot of resources that are out there, that can even help you have that conversation with a friend or a loved one.
Got it. Yeah. Thanks, Abby.
Yeah, thank you.